In the early hours of a quiet autumn morning, tragedy struck in a way no one could have imagined. What seemed like a typical family, living a peaceful life in a small town, would soon be at the center of a shocking crime that tore apart not just their home, but the entire community. It began with a secret one that had been hidden for far too long. Carmen Lewis was a wife and mother who had everything, at least from the outside. Her marriage to Mark had lasted over 20 years, and together they had raised their daughter Lila. But underneath that picture-perfect life, Carmen was living a lie. She had fallen into an affair with someone she never should have, her daughter's boyfriend, Ryan. For months, Carmen and Ryan kept their affair hidden, their secret meetings creating a storm of lies that couldn't be contained forever. Then came the breaking point. One fateful night, the truth finally surfaced in the worst possible way, leading to a brutal confrontation that no one could walk away from unscathed. The affair had turned deadly, leaving behind a trail of violence and betrayal that shocked everyone who knew them. A life was lost, and the dark secrets that had been buried for so long were now out in the open. Today, we uncover the disturbing details of this twisted love triangle and the devastating events that followed. How did this secret affair spiral into such a grisly murder? And what led a mother to make choices that would destroy everything she had built? Carmen Lewis had always seemed like the perfect mother and wife. She was well known around town, always involved in local events, and respected by those who knew her. But behind the closed doors of her home, things were far from perfect. Carmen had been living a double life, one that would eventually lead to the destruction of her family. Her husband Mark and their daughter Lila had no idea that the quiet woman they trusted was hiding a secret so dark it would tear them apart. It all started a few months before everything came crashing down. Carmen met Ryan Parker, Lila's boyfriend, at a family gathering. He was 24, just a couple of years older than Lila, and from the start, there was something about him that caught Carmen's attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was the fact that her own marriage had started to feel dull. Whatever it was, Carmen couldn't help but feel drawn to him, even though she knew it was wrong. Ryan had been dating Lila for about a year at that point. He was charming, good-looking, and came from a respectable family. He seemed like the perfect match for Lila, who adored him. But Carmen's attraction to Ryan soon turned into something more. At first, it was just innocent flirting, a few glances exchanged at family dinners or casual conversations at gatherings. But as the weeks passed, Carmen and Ryan started texting each other. The texts were innocent at first, nothing that could raise suspicions, but as time went on, the messages became more personal and crossed the line from friendly to something much more dangerous. One evening, Carmen found herself alone at home. Mark was away on a business trip, and Lila had gone out with friends. She hadn't planned on seeing Ryan that night, but when she texted him, he responded right away. He said he could come over for a bit to keep her company. Before she knew it, Carmen had invited him over, and what should have been an innocent visit quickly turned into a secret affair. They kept it hidden from Lila and Mark for months, meeting up whenever they could. Carmen and Ryan were careful, making sure not to leave any obvious clues. But the affair was beginning to take its toll. Carmen found it harder and harder to look her daughter in the eyes. The guilt was eating away at her, yet she couldn't stop herself. She knew it was wrong, but at the same time she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Ryan, on the other hand, didn't seem to feel the same level of guilt. For him, it was all about the thrill. He was still seeing Lila, pretending everything was normal, while sneaking around with her mother behind her back. He thought he could keep both relationships going without getting caught. But secrets like these don't stay buried forever. As Carmen became more involved with Ryan, she began to distance herself from Mark. He noticed the changes in her behavior, the way she was always on her phone, the coldness in her voice when she spoke to him. Mark didn't suspect an affair. At first, he just thought Carmen was going through a rough patch. After all, they'd been married for over 20 years, and he figured they were just hitting one of those rough spots that every couple goes through. Little did he know that his wife had already betrayed him in the worst way possible. Then came the day when Lila started to sense something was wrong too. She noticed Ryan becoming more distant, not responding to her messages as quickly as before, making excuses to avoid spending time with her. At first, she thought he might be stressed with work, but as the weeks went on, it became clear that something else was going on. Lila confided in her mother, telling Carmen about her concerns with Ryan. Carmen listened, pretending to be a caring and supportive mother, all the while knowing that she was the reason for Ryan's change in behavior. She felt a deep sense of shame, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The affair had taken on a life of its own, and Carmen was trapped in a web of lies that was getting harder to control. As the tension grew, the once peaceful home started to feel like a ticking time bomb. Everyone could sense that something was off, but no one could quite put their finger on what it was. Carmen knew the truth would come out eventually, and when it did, the fallout would be catastrophic. The day everything changed started out like any other. Lila had planned a surprise dinner for Ryan to try and fix things between them. She invited him over to her parents' house, hoping the familiar setting would remind him of the good times they had shared. Ryan agreed, thinking it would be just another night he'd have to juggle his secret life. Carmen, unaware of Lila's plans, had no idea that her worlds were about to collide in the most devastating way. As Lila prepared the dinner, Ryan showed up, greeted by the warm smiles of both Lila and her mother. But the tension in the air was thick, even if Lila couldn't see it. Carmen and Ryan exchanged a brief, knowing glance, their secret hanging between them like a dark cloud. The dinner was awkward from the start. Ryan was clearly uncomfortable, and Lila tried her best to make small talk, unaware of the real reason for the tension. Mark, oblivious to everything, noticed Ryan's strange behavior but chalked it up to nerves. He figured young couples went through ups and downs, and maybe Ryan was just going through something personal. But then, in the middle of the meal, Lila excused herself to grab something from the kitchen. As soon as she was out of the room, Carmen and Ryan found themselves alone at the table, their guilt and anxiety boiling to the surface. Carmen knew this was the moment everything could fall apart. What she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Lila returned to the dining room, only to find Ryan and her mother standing too close for comfort. In that instant, something clicked. The way they looked at each other, the tension in the air, it all made sense. Lila stood frozen in shock, unable to process what she was seeing. She had never imagined that her own mother could betray her like this. Everything came crashing down in that moment. The carefully constructed lies, the secrets, the betrayal, it was all out in the open now, and there was no going back. The family that once seemed so perfect was now broken beyond repair. And this was just the beginning of a much darker, much deadlier chapter in their lives. The truth was out in the open now, and the weight of it was suffocating. Lila stood frozen, overwhelmed by the shocking revelation that her mother had betrayed her in the worst way possible. The affair between Carmen and Ryan was no longer just a secret, it was the cause of a deep wound that would change everything. Lila's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. The pieces were all falling into place now: Ryan's growing distance, her mother's strange behavior, and the tension that had been building over the past few months. All the signs had been there, but she had never imagined that it would lead to this. Her own mother, the person she trusted most in the world, had been involved with her boyfriend behind her back. Unable to handle the emotions swirling inside her, Lila stormed out of the dining room, desperate to escape the sight of them. She felt anger, betrayal, and confusion all at once. She needed space to breathe, to think, to understand how her life had taken such a sudden, devastating turn. Carmen, now fully realizing the damage her actions had caused, hurried after her daughter. She had feared this moment for weeks but had hoped it would never come. Now, face to face with the reality of her betrayal, she struggled to find the words to explain. But what could she say to make any of this right? The damage was done, and there was no easy way to fix it. Lila, however, was too consumed by her emotions to listen. Her mind was racing, and all she wanted was to get away from the lies, the betrayal, and the people who had hurt her. As Carmen tried to speak, Lila's rage only grew, and she lashed out in anger, demanding to know how long the affair had been going on. The more Carmen tried to explain, the more it fueled Lila's fury. Meanwhile, Ryan stayed behind in the dining room, unsure of what to do. He could hear the heated argument between Lila and her mother, but he didn't move. The gravity of the situation was finally sinking in. For him, the affair had always been a thrill, something exciting and forbidden. But now, seeing the real pain it had caused, he began to realize the full consequences of his actions. As the argument between Carmen and Lila continued, Mark finally stepped in. He had been trying to ignore the growing tension in the house, but now it was impossible to ignore. He heard the raised voices from the kitchen and knew something serious was happening. When he walked into the room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lila stood on one side, her face flushed with anger, while Carmen looked pale and shaken, standing on the other side of the room. At that moment, the full extent of the betrayal became clear. The affair between Carmen and Ryan was no longer a secret, and the family was crumbling under the weight of it. Mark could feel something was terribly wrong, but he didn't know the exact details yet. As he looked at both Lila and Carmen, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Lila, feeling overwhelmed and betrayed, couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She left the room, unable to bear the sight of her mother and Ryan together. The house, once filled with warmth and comfort, now felt cold and unfamiliar. The family that had once seemed so close-knit was now breaking apart, and there was no way to stop it. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became unbearable. Lila refused to speak to Carmen, locking herself away in her room, leaving only when absolutely necessary. The betrayal had shattered her trust, and she couldn't even look at her mother. Carmen, on the other hand, was drowning in guilt. She knew she had destroyed her family, and every attempt she made to fix things only seemed to make the situation worse. The affair with Ryan had been a mistake, and now she was paying the price for it. Mark, trying to cope with the shock of the affair, distanced himself from everyone. He didn't know how to feel or what to think. The woman he had loved and trusted for over 2 decades had betrayed him, and he was struggling to process it all. He spent most of his time away from the house, avoiding Carmen as much as possible. The once happy home they had built together was now falling apart. Ryan, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to keep his distance from the Lewis family. He hadn't expected things to unravel like this, and now he was caught in the middle of a disaster. His relationship with Lila was over, and he knew there was no fixing that. He had hurt her in a way that couldn't be undone. Then, late one night, the tension that had been building for days finally exploded. Mark had been out all day, trying to escape the pain of his broken marriage, when he returned home to a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. The house was too quiet, and something didn't feel right. As he walked through the empty house, his stomach began to twist with a sense of dread. He called for Carmen, but there was no answer. He checked the living room, the kitchen, but found nothing. Then, in the hallway, he saw it. A trail of blood smeared across the floor, leading toward the bedroom. Panic surged through him as he rushed toward the bedroom, the fear in his chest growing with every step. When he opened the door, what he saw made his blood run cold. Carmen was lying on the floor, motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood. The room was in disarray, with signs of a struggle everywhere. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her body lay lifeless in the middle of the carnage. The woman he had once loved was gone, and in that moment, Mark's world shattered completely. The affair had torn his family apart, and now it had claimed the life of the woman who had betrayed him. The nightmare was far from over. The discovery of Carmen's body sent shockwaves through the small town of Harper Springs. News of the brutal murder spread quickly, and the quiet streets were soon filled with whispers of suspicion and fear. The once respected Lewis family was now the center of a horrifying crime, and the question on everyone's mind was who could have done this. Mark was in complete shock. The image of his wife's lifeless body on the bedroom floor haunted him, and as the paramedics arrived to confirm what he already knew, he felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. The betrayal, the affair, and now the murder. It was too much to process. The police were called immediately, and within hours the house became a crime scene, swarmed by investigators trying to piece together what had happened. Detective Julia Emerson was assigned to lead the investigation. She had worked homicide cases for years and had seen her fair share of brutal crimes, but something about this one felt different. The affair, the family secrets, the tension that had clearly been building for months, it all pointed to something far more complicated than a random act of violence. Emerson knew from the start that this case would be anything but straightforward. The first step was to question Mark. As the husband of the victim, he was the natural starting point. Sitting across from Emerson in the small interview room at the police station, Mark looked like a man who had been utterly broken by grief. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he recounted the events leading up to the discovery of Carmen's body. He explained how everything had fallen apart in the days following the revelation of the affair, and how his relationship with Carmen had been strained, but he insisted he had nothing to do with her death. As the interview went on, Emerson couldn't help but notice the pain in Mark's voice. His words were filled with regret and sadness, and while she couldn't rule him out as a suspect, there was something about his demeanor that told her he wasn't the one who had committed the murder. He was a man caught in the middle of a tragedy, but not the one who had caused it. Next on Emerson's list was Ryan. As the other man involved in the affair, he was now a prime suspect. When the detectives brought him in for questioning, Ryan appeared nervous and uneasy. He hadn't spoken to Lila since the night of the confrontation, and now he was being questioned about the murder of her mother. The pressure was getting to him, and Emerson could see it in the way he fidgeted with his hands and avoided eye contact. Ryan admitted to the affair without much hesitation. He explained how it had started, how they had kept it hidden for months, and how the situation had spiraled out of control after Lila found out. But when asked about the murder, Ryan denied any involvement. He claimed that he hadn't seen Carmen since the night of the confrontation, and that he had spent the night of the murder at home, alone. The problem was, Ryan had no alibi. There was no one to confirm where he had been the night Carmen was killed, and that made him a prime suspect in the eyes of the detectives. His affair with Carmen gave him a motive, and his inability to provide an alibi left him in a vulnerable position. As the investigation continued, Emerson and her team combed through the evidence found at the crime scene. The signs of a struggle were clear: overturned furniture, broken glass, blood splatters across the room, but something about the scene didn't quite add up. It was too chaotic, too personal. This wasn't the work of a random intruder. Whoever had killed Carmen had known her, and they had done it in a fit of rage. Forensics collected DNA samples from the crime scene, but the results would take time. In the meantime, the detectives focused on the people closest to Carmen: Mark, Lila, and Ryan. Emerson knew that the answer to the mystery lay somewhere in their tangled relationships, but finding out who was responsible for Carmen's death would require digging deeper into the secrets they were all hiding. Lila was devastated by her mother's death. Despite the betrayal, Carmen was still her mother, and losing her in such a violent way was a pain she couldn't describe. When the detectives questioned her, she struggled to hold back tears as she recounted the events leading up to the murder. She talked about how she had discovered the affair, the anger and hurt she felt, and how she had distanced herself from her mother in the days that followed. But Lila insisted she had no part in her mother's death. She explained that she had been staying with a friend the night it happened, trying to get away from the tension at home. Her friend confirmed her alibi, and while Lila had every reason to be angry with her mother, there was no evidence linking her to the crime. As the days passed, the investigation began to stall. There were no eyewitnesses, no clear motive beyond the affair, and no solid evidence pointing to a single suspect. Ryan remained at the top of the list, but without any proof of his involvement, the detectives couldn't make an arrest. Emerson grew frustrated as the case dragged on, knowing that the longer it took to solve, the harder it would be to get justice for Carmen. Then, a breakthrough came. The forensic results were in, and they revealed something unexpected. There was DNA on Carmen's body that didn't belong to Mark, Lila, or Ryan. It belonged to someone else entirely, someone who hadn't been on the detectives' radar until now. The DNA matched that of an unknown male, and with this new piece of evidence, the investigation took a sudden turn. Emerson and her team had to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the case. If neither Mark, Lila, nor Ryan was responsible for Carmen's murder, then who was? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emerson ordered a re-examination of the evidence, looking for anything they might have missed. The investigation was far from over, and now, with the DNA results pointing to an unknown suspect, the detectives had a new path to follow. As the case took this unexpected turn, the once clear-cut investigation into a family's betrayal was about to reveal even darker secrets that no one could have predicted. With the DNA evidence pointing to an unknown male, the investigation took a sharp turn. Detective Julia Emerson, who had been so focused on the tangled relationships between Carmen, Mark, Lila, and Ryan, now had to confront the possibility that someone else entirely might be responsible for the murder. But how did this unknown person fit into the picture? And why had they killed Carmen? The investigation team began tracing back every possible connection Carmen could have had. They combed through phone records, financial statements, and even dug deeper into her social life. It was a painstaking process, but they couldn't leave any stone unturned. As they examined Carmen's digital footprint, a peculiar connection emerged, one that hadn't been obvious at first. Carmen had been in contact with a man named Lucas Haynes, a handyman who had done some work on the Lewis family's home months before the murder. At first, his name had seemed insignificant, just another contractor in the long list of people who had worked for the family. But now, with the new DNA evidence in hand, everything changed. Lucas had a record: minor offenses, nothing violent, but enough to raise suspicion. Could he have been the one behind the murder? The detectives tracked Lucas down, bringing him in for questioning. Lucas was a quiet man in his mid-30s, with a history of odd jobs around town. When asked about Carmen, he claimed he barely knew her. He said they had only spoken in passing while he was working on the house. But Emerson wasn't convinced. She pressed him harder, pointing out the DNA evidence that tied him to the crime scene. Lucas grew visibly uncomfortable as the interrogation continued. Under pressure, Lucas admitted that he had visited Carmen's house more recently than he had first claimed. He said Carmen had called him, asking for help with a small repair. At first, it seemed like a routine job, but Lucas quickly revealed there had been more to their relationship. He confessed that Carmen had begun confiding in him about her problems, her troubled marriage, the affair with Ryan, and the growing tension with her family. According to Lucas, Carmen had been feeling trapped and overwhelmed, and she had leaned on him for support. What had started as a professional relationship had slowly turned into something more personal. But Lucas insisted he had nothing to do with Carmen's death. He claimed that he hadn't seen her in the days leading up to the murder, and that the DNA evidence could be explained by his earlier visits to the house. The detectives weren't sure if they believed him, but without any direct evidence linking him to the crime, they were stuck. As the days went on, Emerson's frustration grew. The case had taken so many twists and turns, and yet they were no closer to solving it. The DNA evidence had led them to Lucas, but there wasn't enough to make an arrest. Ryan, who had initially seemed like the prime suspect, was still under suspicion, but they couldn't find any hard evidence against him either. And then there was Mark, the grieving husband who had been left shattered by the betrayal and the murder of his wife. Every angle of the case seemed to lead to a dead end. Just as it seemed like the investigation had stalled once again, a new piece of information came to light. One of Carmen's friends, who had been out of town during the initial investigation, came forward with a startling revelation. She told the detectives that in the weeks leading up to her death, Carmen had confided in her about someone who had been stalking her, someone who had made her feel unsafe in her own home. Carmen hadn't told Mark about it, not wanting to worry him, but she had been growing increasingly paranoid that someone was watching her. The detectives immediately followed up on this lead, and what they uncovered sent chills down their spines. Lucas Haynes, the handyman, had developed an unhealthy obsession with Carmen. What had started as casual conversations had turned into something far more sinister. He had begun watching her, following her, and even breaking into her home when she wasn't there. Carmen, desperate to keep her family from falling apart, had kept this a secret, hoping it would all go away. But it hadn't. The night of the murder, Lucas had broken into the house, intending to confront Carmen about her rejection of him. What followed was a violent confrontation that ended with Carmen's brutal death. The DNA evidence, combined with the new information from Carmen's friend, painted a clear picture of what had happened. Lucas had been the one to murder Carmen, driven by his obsession and his anger at her for trying to distance herself from him. When the detectives confronted Lucas with the new evidence, he finally broke down and confessed. He admitted to killing Carmen in a fit of rage after she rejected his advances. He had been stalking her for weeks, growing more and more frustrated that she wasn't giving him the attention he wanted. The night of the murder, he had snapped, and the result had been deadly. The case was finally closed. Lucas was arrested and charged with Carmen's murder, and the once confusing puzzle of the affair and the betrayal now had a tragic conclusion. The obsession that Lucas had developed, fueled by Carmen's vulnerability, had led to the destruction of an entire family. As the trial moved forward, the town of Harper Springs tried to make sense of the tragedy. The affair between Carmen and Ryan had been the catalyst for the chaos, but in the end, it was Lucas' dark obsession that had caused her death. Lila, Mark, and even Ryan were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, forever changed by the events that had unfolded. In the aftermath, Lila and Mark struggled to move on. The memory of Carmen's betrayal and her brutal murder haunted them both, but they knew they had to find a way to live with the pain. The story of Carmen's death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control when secrets are kept and obsessions take hold. The case of Carmen Lewis was over, but the scars it left on the family and the town would remain for years to come.